Welcome everybody. We will be starting up now. So today's webinar is manual lens techniques. And yeah, welcome back everyone after a bit of the holiday break. We're happy to be back and bringing you this live webinar, continuing our digital cinematography exploration. My name is Tom Strnad. I'm the lead digital artist of the Creator Space. And yeah, I want to welcome you to today's workshop. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go through a bunch of different things. And I put a note up, and you can definitely access, if you go to our website, tbmcs.ca, you can access the past cinematography workshops where you can find one that's specifically on manual cinematography. And some of the techniques will be kind of moving on from that point. But if you explore that, you'll be able to learn about some of the kind of intro sections to where we're going with today. But definitely a lot of, we'll go over a lot of the concepts and have some fun as we look at different lenses and what they do and the manual lenses. The best part is that the camera that we're using to demo with and the lenses, these are available through our library partners. So the Blue Mountains Public Library, you can access the equipment there. You go to our website, you can take the proficiency test if you don't already have access to the equipment. You need a valid library membership card, and the equipment is also going to be available through the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So stay tuned to our website and we'll announce when that is available to start placing holds and taking out as well. So a lot of exciting news coming up. Okay, so today, here's the overview. We're going to look at the Blackmagic Pocket 4K camera. Just talk about it briefly, and then we will have some time to explore the lenses and really focus on manual lenses and what they do with the camera. So again, you can access our website, and there's a ton of videos on the camera itself and how it works and all that fun stuff. It's a great camera. Manual lens overview, we're going to look at prime lens characteristics, different lenses for different shot types, demo with the camera. So then we'll explore attaching a lens, just going over that, adding filters to the lens. Really the kits come with ND filters or neutral density filters, so we'll look at adding those. Manual focus techniques, manual exposure techniques, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. So a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. So the Blackmagic Pocket 4K cinema camera, here's just a little intro. So the compact digital cinema camera with a form factor similar to a DSLR, and we'll see it shortly, but if you're not familiar with it, it looks kind of like a Canon 5D, and that's kind of the idea, that it's a similar handheld type digital cinema camera. So it's a video camera, also referred to as a digital cinema camera. It's capable of doing HD through to 4K resolutions, and it can also do some high frame rates, so you can do slow motion with it, which is really a great tool for it to use as well. It has a micro four third lens mount, or MFT, and by using adapters, EFFD, and other mounts can be used. So the one I'm demoing with today, I'm using some EF lenses, and that's how our kit is set up at the Blue Mountains Public Library. So we have some Rokinon prime EF lenses. And the Wasaga Beach kit, it's using a direct MFT or micro four thirds prime lenses. So you don't, it's the same idea. We're just attaching lenses to it, but it's just a different direct mount versus using an adapter in between. So again, as I said before, you can borrow this kit. So it's a 1 week term from the Blue Mountains Public Library, and coming soon to the Wasaga Beach Public Library. And what you need to do is do an online proficiency test, which you can do on the website, tbmcs.ca, and then you just need a valid library card for that particular library. And then in the winter, later in the winter, I guess we're already in the winter, we will be adding a kit to the Collingwood Public Library as well. So we'll keep everyone updated on that. So it's really exciting. So everyone can access this through our library partners. Directly through the libraries, you'll be able to access the same camera that we're looking at today. So manual lens overview. So, and again, you can rewatch this Crowdcast video, and we post these on our YouTube channel. So, you can take some notes, but you'll be able to rewatch this and go over all the stuff we talk about. So the digital cinema camera kits consist of prime manual lenses. So prime refers to having a fixed focal length. So usually things like, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and that's the focal length of the lens. So think of it as a telescope, and then, you're thinking about, how far that focal length is. So usually a wider lens will be a little bit narrower, right? And a telephoto will be longer, kind of like a telescope. So same idea, that's that focal length idea. Whereas a zoom will have a variable. So we can have something like a 24 to 105 millimeter, which is common in our photography cameras and part of what we have with our kit as well, with the Canon 6D kit. So the prime lens, it offers a little bit more light sensitivity. So they're usually referred to as a fast lens. So here's some of the main characteristics of the manual lens as well. So a manual lens can also be a zoom lens. So here's the characteristics. One, the aperture is manual. So the f-stop has a control ring. So your exposure is totally controlled manually and it stays wherever you set it. So it's not adjusting. Unlike phones where the aperture, the exposure is being adjusted continually, auto exposure, this is totally manual exposure. So the ring opens and closes. Then two, the focus is manual. So the focus ring turns to focus. So you go from minimum focus to infinity focus. Minimum focus means, how close can you be in focus, right? So if I'm in focus right now in this camera, right? If I start to come out here, I'm a little bit less in focus, right? So this is the focus range, right? So, where am I in focus? Where am I out of focus? So that kind of, I can be really close in this particular lens I'm using, or some lenses have like a minimum focus of 1.5 meters. And we'll look at that today when we get to our 85 millimeter, our longer lens. Then also the last thing here is that the zoom is manual if it is a zoom lens. So you actually have to move through the going from wider, wide angle to telephoto. You're actually manually, there's the zoom ring. So you might have three particular rings. So at a minimum, there's an aperture manual ring, a focus ring, and you may have a zoom ring if it's not a prime. So that's a really interesting fact about these lenses. So let me just grab one of the lenses here, and we'll be able to actually just quickly see through. And I think this is always a cool aspect. So there you can see how it's all the way open, and then I'm closing it down. So that's that manual aperture, being able to adjust the exposure. So all the way open to close to a 22, to a f22, right? So that's the cool thing about manual. So it's not digital, it's totally manual with blades in the lens opening and closing. And that's the really fun part. So again, then we have our focus ring, right on the front here. So we're able to focus and it tells us distances of where it is to the camera, to the subject. And we have our aperture ring in this case. This is a prime, so there's no zoom ring. There would be a third one, which would allow you to zoom. Okay, so that's the characteristics of the manual lens. So prime lens characteristics. So there's a little bit different versus, here we talked about the manual lens overview. Now let's look at prime lenses specifically. So these are non-zoom lenses. So what that means is they have a fixed focal length, which means they cannot be changed except with front or rear adapters. And we're going to get into a little bit of that modification in some upcoming workshops, which is another fun thing. You can change the characteristics of the lens in a bit as well. So with a fixed focal length, it requires the camera to move to frame the shot as desired. So you're totally working with the lens and the camera and getting your frame, versus a zoom where you might just zoom in or out to get the frame and the shot. So this makes the lens, the prime lens, generally a bit smaller than a zoom lens, which needs to deal with that maximum focal length to the minimum focal length. And then also, as I mentioned before, the prime lens is faster and offers more light sensitivity, making it ideal for low light situations. So that again can be for a place that's not super bright. I have a little bit of sun coming in through a window here right now, but the editing suite here, my studio is not very bright, but I'm using generally wide open lenses, f2 or lower to get this kind of an overall exposure range without a lot of extra light. I just have a couple extra lights in here. So not a ton of lighting in a relatively dark room. So that's the speed factor that makes them a bit of a faster lens. So that's really cool. Okay. So then there's a bunch of the artistic aspects, and I think this is the really cool part of what the prime lens can do, and we'll look at that as we explore the different lenses. So because they're generally fast, they offer a low f-stop, such as 1.8 or less. This open wide setting can help create the shallow depth of field. We talked about this in some of the earlier workshops. So shallow depth of field allows you to have a subject in focus with the background blurred, and that also allows you to select the focus manually. So you can focus, and we'll look at that today, focusing from different subjects, planes in the field. So you can focus from something in the foreground, middle ground to background. And that's called pulling focus. And that can also help the audience go through the story. It helps tell the story. The prime lens also helps achieve the artistic frames. Since you can't move the camera, you have to move the camera versus zooming in or out. So that helps you really think about, okay, this is the shot, this is how I want to frame it, and then you move it around to get your precise framing. So it helps to tend with your, it tends to help with your composition in digital cinematography. The other thing that we notice a lot, if you look in films or TV shows that you love, there's a lot of moving shots. So you'll see things like dolly shots or stabilizer shots that are using a prime lens, and then what you do is you move the camera. So that moving camera is quite unique to motion pictures, and that allows us to, right now this camera that you're watching me on is on a tripod, but you know, it could be on a dolly, it could be moving left or right, and we're using that prime lens and then moving around. So you can move closer to me and so on, but you're not zooming, we're taking the camera and moving it to reframe our action. So the prime lens lets us do that versus the zoom lens that can just zoom in or out, right? So that's another really cool feature. Okay, so here's the shallow depth of field. Here's a example, you know, so when it's wide open, and look at the shallow depth of field. So we have the subject in the foreground here, and everything's blurred behind her. So that's a really nice sample I like of shallow depth of field with a longer lens, opened all the way wide open, and it gives us that shallow depth of field. So that's what's possible. So exposure and depth of field. So manual apertures allows the operator to control the depth of field by opening and closing the aperture, smaller or larger f-stop. So here's just a quick overview from things that we talked about in previous sessions. Smaller f-stop, less depth of field. So smaller f-stop means it's closed more. So just as I showed you the lens when it's closed all the way, the larger f-stop, actually, sorry, this is the opposite way. Opening and closing the aperture. So I should say the smaller the aperture is, you have less depth of field, right? So that's what this is referring to. The larger it is, the more open it is. There's a T22 or F22, the more depth of field, right? So the smaller the f-stop number, not the actual aperture itself, the number. So if I'm at a 2, the less depth of field, so it's shallow. If it's larger, if it's a 22, let's say, then there's more depth of field. So it has this longer infinity type of depth of field, right? So that's a really interesting thing with depth of field. So different lenses can help with different shot types, and we'll go through all the different lenses that we can attach today. So using different lenses, we can create different shot types without having to move the camera. And this is another great thing. So just because we have a prime lens, it doesn't mean that we're just stuck with, okay, this is the prime lens. We can switch the lenses. And that's what's really cool about this Blackmagic Pocket 4K is that it has a lens mount, and we can detach a lens. So it doesn't have a fixed lens, whereas some video cameras might just have a fixed lens and that's all you have and you can't change it. So we can keep changing different lenses onto this. So we can go from wide lenses to telephoto lenses, and by changing them, we're changing the types of shots, the characteristics of the lenses, and so on. So a wider lens, for example, going out to like a fisheye, will have more depth of field as well. So think of a phone, a GoPro has a lot of depth of field, and then a telephoto lens is a shallower depth of field, just in the nature of it, because it's like a telescope. So it has, you know, that light is traveling and it's a little bit more directional into it, and it creates a shallower depth of field. So like an 85 millimeter will already have a shallower depth of field versus a 16 millimeter or 10 millimeter that's wider, right? So that lens type can affect the depth of field as well. So for example here, I just made a note, the 16 millimeter lens provides a wide shot. When you put it on the camera, a 50 millimeter can create a close-up. So what could this look like? I pulled a couple still grabs of, the same type of, this is just for a documentary that we did for the, that I shot for the Blue Mountain Foundation for the Arts, just an overview of the foundation. And here's two different shots. So one is with the 16 millimeter wide shot, one is 85 millimeter close-up shot. So you can see it's the same camera, and look at the characteristics. So just as I mentioned, the 16 millimeter wide open has a little bit more depth of field because it's a wider lens. And then the 85 millimeter, the close-up shot, has a shallower depth of field, and you can really see the blurred background and that artistic look to it. I really like that idea of being able to see the subject, but the background having it a bit out of focus like that, or a nice blur. In the wide shot, again, it's a bit out of focus, but not necessarily as much out of focus as we have in the 16 millimeter, right? So that's a good comparison of between the two shots, and what that can look like, and how does that relate to the artistic uses. So again, the wide shot will have that kind of a wider look. Think of the subject too, less intimate necessarily. We're not like right in there with the person, but that 85 millimeter really gets close into the person, with the person. We feel, when the person's talking, we can relate to them more. So it gives a whole different kind of artistic look. Think about films that you like, sequences. Oftentimes there's a wide shot, then we get into close-up shots. So the prime lenses can just be changing. So with digital cinema, with prime manual lenses, we'll start with wide shots if we want, and then we move into close-up shots. And that's very typical. If you think of most films that you'll watch, there's going to be that kind of a wide shot, establishing, if you will, establishing where we are, what's happening, what characters there are, and then having closer shots. So we could be putting longer lenses and reframing a little bit, but it's that beauty of using a prime lens that's fixed and just saying, okay, now I'm going to go into the 50 millimeter, 85 millimeter for a close-up, and go from there. So that's a really fun part of all our using the manual and prime lenses as well. Okay, so let's have a look here now. We'll go through a camera demo. So let's explore the manual lenses, and again, you can rewatch these notes, the pre-notes that I talked about. So what we're going to do is go through these elements. So we'll attach a lens, we'll add some filters, we'll look at NDs, manual focus techniques, focus pulling, and manual exposure techniques. And that's the fun thing too, is that we can actually pull exposure if we want to, going from darker areas to lighter areas. So we'll just explore all of these concepts and just look at what it looks like to be, with the camera. Okay, so we're set up here. So I have a Blackmagic Pocket cinema camera 4K right here. So this is what the body looks like. I'm just gonna stand up here and just be able to spin it around a little bit. So this is the body in the 4K. I just have a little bit of a cage on it, and some rods and things. So the different kits in the different libraries will have different elements to them. So this is a really typical, the body here, and we have a lens. In this case, I have a 10 millimeter lens. So quite a wide. You can see it's kind of a convex front, so it's kind of a fisheye style look to it, and that's pretty neat. So it gives us a pretty wide shot. What does that end up looking like? Let me spin it just back around here. So that's the camera body. So now I'm just going to cut over to the actual shot that it's seeing. So this is the actual camera. So again, you can see it's really wide. You can see this is my studio. Again, not a lot of light. So that's the 10 millimeter prime lens. And what does that look like a little bit closer up? So here's an angle. Just going to get a little bit more light on it here. So here's kind of what the lens ends up looking like with another angle. So we got our ability to change the focus here. So you can see this little infinity symbol means infinity, and then I can change it based on, I'll just put my hand up on this side over here. So I can change it based on where I am. So you can see it slowly goes. There's a metric on the right and imperial on the left. So I can focus relatively close in this. Look at the minimum focus is 24 centimeters. So that's really pretty close up. And so I just adjust the focus until I'm in focus. And in this case, it's pretty close to infinity where I need to be for the wide shot. And then beside it here, I'm just going to spin this around a little bit so we can see that. So beside it here, we see our aperture ring right here. So this one starts at 3. So usually these wider kind of fisheye lenses aren't necessarily as fast. And we'll see as we get to the other lenses, they start at a 1.5 and around that range. So a lot more wide open. And so I can just make this, I can go anywhere from 22 to open to 3, right? So that's how we can do that. So you can see again, manual ring for the focus, manual ring for the aperture. And that's the basis there. So let's go back to the shot and we'll just look at what it does in this kind of sense. So here's the focus. So I can adjust my focus. You can see it's out of focus because the subject is quite far away. And in this lens, once I hit about a meter away, okay, so that's telling me it's in focus about a meter away, then I'm gonna basically reach my infinity focus. So now everything's in focus in the background and so on. Here's my aperture ring, right? So I can totally close it down. So that's closed. I don't have a lot of light, so I'm going to be working with kind of an open aperture concept here. And that's it. So I'm at just about a 3 and a bit, 3.1. And that's what that lens can do. So aperture, focus, and we can shift from that. Now here, the focus pulling, there's not a lot for me to demo in that because it's a wide angle lens. So now let's go into the next lens. So I'm gonna now show you guys we're gonna go over how to remove the lens. So I'm just gonna spin this around here, get this focus to the back here a bit more. Okay, so how this works is, let me just get a little bit more light in there, that's nice. Okay, so how this works is, we just have a button here, a release button. So I'm gonna release that, and we spin this around and take the lens off. Okay, and now what we have is there's a red dot right here, and there's also a red dot on the lens. So the red dot lines up with this red dot. We click it on, and we then spin, it would be clockwise if we're at the front of the camera body itself. Okay, so I'm going to go from the 10 millimeter to a 16 millimeter. Let me just find that. Here it is. Okay, then the other thing that we want to look at is in the actual lens itself, right? We're going to usually have a back lens cap like so. And what I'm going to want to do is take that lens cap off, right? It just spins off like so, spin it off. Okay, and now again, I have the red dot. I'm going to line it up to the camera right over here. And so again, red dot to red dot. I'm going to click it in and spin it. And there's a little click. So it goes click, and that's it. And again, we just press this lever, push down, and slide it counterclockwise from the front to remove. So let's just show that again. So if I push the lever down here, counterclockwise, remove the lens, and it's off. Okay, so let's bring it back on. It's gonna click, and that's it. That's how easy it is to take the lens on or off. So that's a nice simple system. Okay, and now let's go right to the camera. So now here's our 16 millimeter. So we're going to start to get a little bit closer. I'm just going to pan this, tilt it down, pan it over. Okay, and you can see I'm out of focus. So I'm going to check my focus. Okay, there we go. That's in focus. Okay, and again, my aperture ring, so I can close it all the way down. I can open it. Okay, and there we go. So now we can see that we have, focus on the subject, which in this case is just a little goat there. And we still have the focus a bit on the background because again, this is a 16 millimeter, fairly wide. We're not going to have a shallow depth of field. And that's the really cool part. So again, what does this all look like? Same thing like with the other lens. There we just have our focus. It's telling us where we're in focus. So it's saying it's about over a meter away, right? But it's not into infinity. And it is about a meter and 1.3 meters, the subject here. Here's our aperture. So in this case, I'm at a 2.8, right? So I always like to just be not open all the way wide, but just close down slightly because there tends to be, most lenses on the kind of these lower end, the Indie Pro side, are sometimes a little bit softer when they're totally open wide. So I always go just that, third of a stop closed to have increased sharpness. So here I can demo that. So here it is. If I open all the way wide, see how it gets a little bit softer? So it's always just that 1/3 of a stop. I just go down just a touch and we get that real nice sharpness of the blades working and helping us with that. Okay, so again, that's the setup there. I'm just gonna get this light up, bring this light down a bit over here. Okay, that's a little bit better. Okay, so again, you can see now the lens is right on here. That's our 16 millimeter. Let's go back to the 10 millimeter and just kind of a comparison. It's not that different in terms of its size, right? So that's the 10 and the 16. These are very, pretty similar. And they'll change, and the characteristics aren't always necessarily what you think they're going to be. Like our 85 millimeter tends to be a bit smaller than the 16 millimeter. The point is what it does and what it's called number-wise, so we know what we're using when we go to longer and wider lenses. Okay, so let's go to our next one. So I have a 24 millimeter lens. Now I should also mention what's great is we have all of these labeled. So in this case, it says here 16 millimeter, and you just click these right on the front. Okay, so what does that look like? And this is, so basically there's just a little press. You press this in, comes off, press it, and it comes back on. And that's how we take the lens cap on or off. I always recommend getting the lens caps on or off. And leaving them on once you finished or you're packing things away. We want to always keep that front element clean and not have too much scratching occurring on it. Okay, so I have a 24 millimeter lens. That's this one here. Let's put that on and see what that looks like as we get into our next shot will look like. Okay, so lens caps, I always take the rear cap, front cap, take those off, spin them off. It's ready to go. Put them back in the case. Okay, and let's cut over to our shot. So again, you can see we're a little bit dark here. So I'm just going to open it up. Okay, now this lens is actually a 1.5, right? So, and that's really cool. So it's really super fast. So I'm just going to go down. So I'm using an ISO of 200 as my base. And so that's the speed of it, of the sensor, how light sensitive it is. And now I'm just going to get in focus here. And now we're going to start to get that shallower depth of field where I have that photo in the background and it's just slightly out of focus. Right, so it's just slightly out of focus. What does this look like here? So again, I see it's a 1.5. I just put it down to a 2. So it's not open all the way, and our focus is close to infinity. We're pretty far away. So this is about a 1 meter and a bit again. So that's that works out nicely. And yeah, so that's where we are with that, with the 24 millimeter. So notice how we're starting to get closer and closer, and it's changing the look of it. And we'll see when we get into the longer. We're going to go to 35, 50, and then an 85, and we'll see how that journey continues. So let's go to this now. I'm going to take the lens off. Right, spinning it off, counterclockwise, clockwise on, counterclockwise off. I'm going to put my lens front cap on. I'm going to put my lens back cap on. Right, so that's all nice and safe and snug. And now I'm going to go to a 35 millimeter. Okay, so the 35 millimeter, I'm going to put it on right here. Okay, so you can hear the click, clockwise on, and let's cut right to it. So again, you can see how we're slowly getting in closer, even though we're not moving the camera, just with the prime lenses, and that's the real fun part. So I'm just going to check the aperture. There we go. And now we can focus. Okay, so here it's interesting because we're really getting the photo is now a bit blurred in the background. So we're getting that shallower depth of field. Now the subject isn't that far away, and then we're going to move the subject a bit closer as we demo some more depth of field concepts. But look at how my photo in the top corner there versus the subjects are. The photo is now a bit out of focus, and the subjects are in focus, and it slowly drifts to an out of focus. So the focus is really a lot more critical. So you can see my hand right here is totally out of focus, right? And that's about halfway through. So that stays soft, but the subjects are in focus. And that's what we're doing there. Okay, so here's just the side. So I'm just at a 2. And in terms of my focus with a 2, I'm just at about 2 meters there. Right about here, so in between, about a couple meters away with the lens. Okay, so let's move on. Now let's put on a 50. Okay, and this one I have a direct micro 4/3 mount 50. So I'm just going to go directly with that. Now I should mention too, it's always a great practice. We have a lens cleaning cloth, so you can just do a circular motion on the lens, front and back, with the lens cleaning cloth. So you want to use the ones that are directly in the kit. And we also have UV filters on the front here, so you won't scratch the direct lens element. And we'll talk a bit about the filter adds in a moment. So this I'm going to, again, red to red, line it all up. Okay, so here's our 50 millimeter. So you can see how we're, again, getting a lot closer. And I'm just going to get that in focus. Look at the... So right now with this one, I am... Oops, my camera's moving on me. With this one, I'm at a 2 again. So keeping that. Focus right, you can see this, the 50 millimeter is a direct micro 4/3 mount there. And look at how now my depth of field is very different once I'm getting to the 50. So now I can really pull, going from the goat to the penguin is a real difference, right? So this is the focus pulling aspect where we go from here to the penguin, and I'd have to do another one to get the photo, right? So watch that, photo to the penguin to the goat. So we have totally 3 different planes of focus now. And that's the really exciting part when we get into these longer lenses with the shallower depth of field, is being able to have that focus shift and that shallower depth of field to really make it interesting in terms of the focus pulling, going from different sources. Okay. So, and last but not least, within our lenses here, and I'll actually, just while we're on this mount right now, let me go to the radical different side of things, which is I have this crazy 7.5 millimeter. This is a 7.5 millimeter super like pancake fisheye lens. Let's put that on just for fun. And it gives some really interesting looks to it. So you can see it's super tiny. That's the front of it like that. Okay, so I'm just going to open it all the way wide. Okay, and I'm just going to go to an ISO of 400, just because this is a 3 in terms of its lighting there, right? So look at that, it's really skewed, super fisheye. So we just went from the 50 to a 7.5. So these kind of fisheye lenses are really cool. There's some really cost effective ones. You can get them for as little as $20, $30. And they're a fun effect. And you can see it's kind of skewing. It really goes into a fisheye effect. And look at the focus now, complete opposite. My hand's in focus all the way to the subject. And my hand is, about 6 centimeters from the lens. This is right on the lens. So it's pretty incredible what the range of this can do. Right, so that's that total opposite of what we just looked at with the 50 millimeter. Right, so that's the 7.5, the pancake fisheye. Okay, now I'm going to put on one of my favorite, the 85 millimeter. Okay, so we'll put the 85 millimeter one right on here. I'm going to go, oops, I got to put my mount on here. So I just have a MFT to EF mount, because these primes are EF. And that's what's available at the Blue Mountains Library. So I put on the 85 millimeter. Notice how it's not what we would expect, because 35 millimeter is actually a bit longer, right? But the way it works is because it has magnification, so it's working just like a telescope in principle. Okay, so we put that on. What does it look like? So here we go. And it's going to go back to, so we're at 200 ISO. I'm going to move it over to 2. Okay, and let's cut right into it. And look at that. Okay, so now we're 85 and getting a bit closer than the 50. Right, and look at our focus again, pulling focus from the goat to the penguin. And to our photo. That's it. So we've gone through those 3 elements. And then the last thing we can do is we can also shift where our chair is. So I have it on a rolling chair. So I'm going to move them a bit forward so we can actually do a little bit more background separation. And that's a great technique for when you're working with manual lenses, is to be able to have a little bit of background separation. So even though we're right here, so I'm just going to roll these guys a bit forward. Okay. You can see now the penguin has hit the focus. But what I need to do is I'm going to change the focus to the goat. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so goat to penguin. And look at that real shallow depth of field. So this is where we're just pulling focus, right? And what does that look like? So what it looks like is basically going from, so I'm going to the penguin, right? And you can see it's 1.7. And then I'm going to the goat, which is about 1.4. So 1.7 to 1.4. So I'm just sliding it back and forth, and that's what a focus pull is, right? So what else we can do is, let's go back to the shot here. So now you can add some more dynamic work, which is actually, focusing from the photo to the penguin to the goat. So we can do a move, so that's a tilt, and we can also do a focus pull. Now one of the last, the cool things too that we can do is we can add a follow focus unit. So I just wanted to demonstrate what that ends up looking like. So I'm just going to put this follow focus unit right onto the rods here. Okay, so now I have this wheel, right, that I can actually spin to adjust my focus, right? And that's what's called a follow focus unit. So I'm just going to line it up, and we have these little gears. And if it doesn't come with the gears on the lens, the cool thing is you can actually get, when you buy a lot of follow focus rings, I'm going to grab it over here, it will come with stuff like this. And this can just be applied on top of a lens, any kind of lens, and you're adding these rings, the gears, to use with the follow focus. So you can see with these ones, they already exist in these cine lenses, but you can attach this to any kind of lens, and then all of a sudden you have the gears. So what does a focus pull look like? And I'm just going to spin this around here. Okay, so now, so if I need to go to the background, I'm pulling away. So the penguin's in focus. And now the goat's in focus. So I'm pulling to it, then I'm pulling away from it. And all I'm doing is shifting my focus points. So what does that look like? So here again with the pull. So I'm pulling to the goat. I'm pulling away from the goat to the penguin. And that's the back and forward motion. So once again, pulling to the goat and then pulling away to the penguin. And you can also use these are discs, white. You can put dry erase marks on them. And then you can actually have a mark from one to the other. Right? And I can also use these stop points to determine where. So that's to the penguin, that clicks there, and that's to the goat right there, right? So that's how we can do that whole full, pulling focus and working with it. So we can incorporate pans, tilts, and pull focus. Now, manual focus, you can just as easily just do with your hand. But the key is to know if someone's going away or close. So if someone's walking towards you, you need to pull to them as they come to you. If they're walking away, you need to pull away. So you're going to like infinity as they walk away, or you're going to minimum focus as they come towards you. So that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. And you just need to practice and rehearse that a little bit more to do that. Now the other thing I can do is, I'm just going to ramp up the ISO here. So let's say we're really bright, and this will be kind of how we can show, we can also do exposure pulls. Okay, so let's go from there. Okay, so that photo is a lot brighter now. Okay. And right? So I can actually do an exposure pull from making the photo brighter and making the penguin a bit darker. And then so I'd also have to combine it with a focus pull. So it definitely gets a little bit trickier, but it helps us to be able to work with different exposure shifts, since that painting is in a lot of a darker zone than we are in the foreground. So this could be really helpful. You can actually do those exposure changes if you're going from inside to outside. So that can work really well to be able to move like from if you're going inside and then to go outside somewhere. So that can be a really interesting tool to use as well. Okay, so now I have the 85mm lens on. And one of the last things I want to show you guys today is adding some ND filters. So we talked about manual focus, focus pull, the exposure, and really the main tip I have with exposure is, what you see is what you get. So I always like to underexpose a little bit with digital video. It's always easier to boost it up rather than trying to reduce it. So always a little bit on the darker side won't hurt you, and you can fix it in the color grading. So that's my main advice there. And remember, we can do those exposure pulls, the focus pulls, and using longer lenses to have a shallower depth of field. We have our aperture ring, and we have our focus ring. And I'm just going to take this unit off now. So that's our unit for our follow focus unit. There's different versions of it. They're not too expensive, so you can get them for like I've seen them for as low as $50 or so. So again, we have our focus ring, we have our aperture ring, and the manual lenses. And then the last thing that we can do is we can add ND filters. Right. So in the front here, we just have a plain UV filter. It's going to get into the focus there. Okay, and what I can do is, if I have too much light, this is kind of the opposite of how I have it set up here, but if I have too much light, we can also add an ND filter, right? So an ND filter, you can see it looks like sunglasses. And we had a great demo of this. You can check out our exterior digital cinematography workshop on our YouTube channel. And there you'll see I demonstrate how to use polarizer, ND filters, but we can also use ND filters inside if there's too much light. And the reason we would use an ND filter inside with manual lenses is to help increase shallower depth of field. So if we want to have a blurred background, we can put an ND filter if we have too much light, so that we can actually open up the aperture to create a shallower depth of field by using an ND filter. So let's look at that. So to put on a filter, there's just threads. So there's threads on the lens. There's threads on the actual filter. And what you do is you just screw it on, again, clockwise from the front of the camera. Screw it on like that, and we want to make sure it's actually screwing on, it doesn't just fall off, right? So I always never let go until I know that, and it just stays on loose. It doesn't have to be tightened, because if you tighten it, it's really hard to remove, and it can require special tools to take it off. If it ever does happen, and you've taken a kit out and you can't remove the ND filter, just bring it back, and we can get it off rather than trying to force it off. Using pliers or anything like that can actually damage the lens. And the ND filter we can always get off with different techniques. At the end of the day, these are only $20, $30, right? Whereas the lens could be up to $700. So we really want to make sure that these filters are just on not too tight, but if they ever do get stuck, just bring it back to us and we can get it off that way. Okay, so I've put the ND filter on. Okay, and so what does that do? So I have the ND filter on. Here is our shot. Okay, so I went down to about 5.6 before. So now with the ND filter, I'm at an ISO 800, so it's as if there's a lot more light in this room. And I'm able to have that shallow depth of field still with the ND filter. Right, so you can see how it's still nice and shallow. Okay. And I'm at 2.8 right now on the side here. So that's a 2.8 on the aperture there. Right, so nice shallow depth of field is happening, and it can work like that. So now let's do the same thing. So I'm at ISO 800, and we're going to just flip it around. So I'm going to take the ND filter off. So I'm just unscrewing it counterclockwise until it comes off, right? And and then it's ready to come off. It comes off. I just put it back into its case. Okay, and now let's go back to this. Now look how bright that is. So we're way overexposed here. So this is what happens if I'm at 800 and I go down a few stops. Look how our shallow depth of field is kind of missing. We don't really get the same effect now. They're almost both in focus. But with an ND filter, and if it's a bright lighting situation, indoors, I'm able to have that shallow depth of field. So that's a big difference in being able to use the ND filter or not using the ND filter. So yeah, that's pretty much takes us through what all the filters are and how this works. And again, always keep everything clean. Circular cleaning with the lens cloth is ideal, right? So we have a UV filter on here. So the lens cloths that come with the kit, just this nice circular motion, keeps everything clean, and we're good to continue filming. Okay, so at this point, I can open it up to Q&A. So if you want to, you can type in any questions, ask any questions, and we can go over a few things. Ultimately, the manual prime lenses are a lot of fun to work with. They can be a challenge, but I think it's a great challenge to undertake, and you can see how quickly we can really work with some interesting, artistic concepts of what's in focus, what's not in focus, and making it work in different ways. So they're a real fun artistic tool to use in digital cinematography and in your filmmaking, and how that can help achieve the desired looks, artistic shots, and being able to pull focus and pulling exposure manually can be really helpful, because then you're in control. And I think that's really important, is it's not your phone, it's not in auto mode, like if you have a DSLR in auto mode or a video camera that's in auto mode, it's really in control, but this keeps you in control. So here's one question here we have. So is it common that you'd add a ND filter on top of the UV filter? So usually I just leave them on. It's not really an issue, because optically the UV filter doesn't take anything away. So the only issue, it's a good question, if something was a wider lens, you might start to see kind of a stacking of filters. So you can take it off. So we recommend, if you're just kind of starting out using the equipment and you're taking it out from our library partners, to leave the UV filter on, because then you just don't run the risk of scratching the actual lens element. So I prefer in the field to keep the UV filters on, unless it's interfering with, if it shows up in the frame. So wider lenses, usually 16 millimeter wider, may have that problem occur. So you can definitely just screw it on top. Stacking filters is very common with matte boxes in digital cinema. There'll be ND filters, polarizer filter, pro mist filter. You could have 3, 4 stacks of filters, and there could even be a rear filter. So stacking filters is a very common practice, as long as you're not creating any unwanted artifacts around the lens due to kind of a tubing of the framing. Yeah, so do I use the ND filter indoors? I use it a lot indoors, usually with in available light situations if I'm not able to control the lighting. So imagine a really bright window skylight situation indoors. It can be so bright that you can't really control the light through the available light. So using an ND filter, I can then actually, open up. Like I showed you guys, if I was, I put it to 800 ISO, and I was able to open it up to have this shallow depth of field. If you don't want shallow depth of field, then you wouldn't want to use the ND filter. So again, here's the shallow depth of field that we achieved with a T2 open up wide. So shallow depth of field versus if I close it down to 5, 6, or up to like 11, I end up with a lot less depth of field. So it's a lot more depth of field, sorry. And then everything, both the characters of the subjects are in focus versus the shallower artistic look that I'm looking for. So again, it's totally a preference thing. If you're trying to get that bokeh or shallow depth of field look with blurred backgrounds, you definitely want to explore using ND filters. And it's interesting because we're very used to always hearing about ND filters for outside and not so much inside. Yeah. So exposure and follow focus changes. So I had that set up with the photo in the background that has no light on it versus my subjects that have light on it. So that exposure change could be really important. Otherwise, the exposure changing can be required to go inside or outside. It's a very common practice if you're doing like a handheld shot or stabilizer shot going from indoors to outdoors, that you're actually pulling exposure just as you would the focus. And then the focus shift always has to happen when you're doing people are moving or the camera's moving, and then you're changing that focus proximity of the lens. So that's the two times you're using the elements there. So you can use the follow focus. That ring that I showed can also be used for the aperture ring. So you can put it on the aperture ring and use it to adjust your exposure. Just as you can pull focus, you can pull the exposure. The only thing is it starts to get complicated if you need to do both. So if I was going inside, outside, following someone, I would only have to be pulling the exposure because my focus would stay the same. So that's a great scenario where it works that way. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so for one more question here. So for bokeh, the what's more important, the lens or the aperture? So it's a little bit of a combination of both. If I'm on a fisheye, like I put that 7.5 millimeter fisheye lens on, I will never get a shallow depth of field with something that wide. So it's just designed to be pretty much like infinity focus. There's a little bit of focus shift in that if something's really close. So if something was really close to the lens, I might be able to have a slightly out of focus background. So, otherwise, when we get into like 24 millimeter and longer, we're able to do more of those background blurs. And the other combination is distance. So I moved the subjects away from the wall so that there's a little bit more distance from the photograph to do a little bit more of that focus pulling. So those are really three elements. Longer lenses tend to help you have a shallower depth of field, and open up wide apertures also help. And then finally, the distances of subjects will play a role as well. So that's how it works there. Okay, so yeah, that's our time for today. So it's really glad that everyone could join us. We have in a couple weeks' time, we have an exterior winter cinematography workshop. We'll be doing some outdoor capturing, and that's a real fun thing, especially here in the Blue Mountains region in southern Georgian Bay, with a lot of the snow that stays here with us for most of the winter. Dealing with snow is can be complicated, and it's a huge white reflective surface, and so we're going to look at exterior winter cinematography. So that's on the 16th. So definitely sign up for that. You can check out more of our past videos and webinars on our YouTube channel. Go to our website, tbmcs.ca, for all the info. And please do check out the camera. And if you haven't, take a proficiency test, and we'll make sure you can access equipment as it's available. So again, thanks for joining us. And again, my name is Tom Strnad. I'm the lead digital artist of the Creator Space. And just want to end off with mentioning all our partners in this project. So I want to thank the Canadian Council for the Arts. And we also have our library partners that make this happen and provide the equipment access through its loan systems. So the Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.